which I have taken the liberty to making minor adjustments occur precisely where the technique, as in the telescoped Little Red Riding Hood word plays, page 49, 116, page 75, 126, or the high-speed imagery of the finale would have made a totally literal rendering meaningless in English. Elsewhere, on occasion, the English may seem simply a bit unorthodox, but so in such cases is the Russian. Other possible translations of the Russian word volshebnik are magician or conjurer, but I have respected Nabokov's express intention that in this case it be rendered as enchanter. Volshebnik was written during October and November of 1939. It was signed V. Sirin, a pseudonym that V.N. used for his Russian writings from his early youth on, so that they would not be confused with those of his father, who had the same given name. Sirin in Russian is both a species of owl and a bird of ancient fables, but probably has no connection, as some have suggested, with the word siren. The original text was dictated to and typed by father's first reader, Vera Nabokov. According to Nabokov's letters, he showed it shortly thereafter to 4 other people, literary friends of his. See author's note 1. At some point, apparently, a typescript was also shown to the émigré critic Vladimir in Paris. It could not have been later than May 1940, when we sailed for New York. Andrew Field, who it seems read an article written nearly 40 years after the fact by a very old beetle not long before his death, claims, in V.N. The Art of Life of Vladimir Nabokov, New York, Crown, 1986, an odd concatenation of rancor, adulation, innuendo, and outright factual error, which I had occasion to read in page proof. The piece shown to Weedle differed in several respects from the Enchanter, of which Field had very sketchy idea at best, having seen only a few 2 pages and one perhaps of both of Nabokov's references presented at the beginning of this volume. Presumably that version was called The Satyr. The girl, who was no more than 10, and the concluding scene was set not on the French Riviera, but the remote little hotel in Switzerland. Field also attributes the name Arthur to the protagonist. It is unclear whether he got that from Weedle too, but more likely he simply gleaned it from father's recollection of his preface to Lolita. I have suggested that Nabokov had thought of his protagonist as Arthur, or perhaps even used that name in a preliminary draft. It is highly unlikely, however, that the name appeared in a manuscript already marked with instructions for the printer, as Field has Weedle affirmed. As for the 3 different Field sites, if his paraphrase of the Weedle article is accurate, then Weedle's memory of that distant event must have been a bit hazy. Field does admit, in fact, that Weedle could not remember whether the girl is named in the story. The fact is that there never was a version called the Satyr. Indeed, such a title would seem almost implausible to anyone with a sensitive ear for Nabokov's use of language, and I would attribute the same degree of credibility to the rest of Weedle's assertions. I was 5 when The Enchanter was being written, and was, if anything, a disruptive influence on our Paris apartment and Riviera pensions. I recall that between generous periods of play with me, father would sometimes withdraw to the bathroom of our meager quarters to work in peace, although not, as John Shade does for shaving purposes, impale fire on a board placed across the tub. While I was already aware that my father was a writer, I had no idea of what was being written, and my parents certainly made no attempt to familiarize me with the story of Volshebnik. I think the only work of father's I knew at the time was his Russian translation of Alice in Wonderland, and the little tales and ditties he would improvise for me. It is possible that when father was writing Volshebnik, I had already been bundled off to Deauville with a cousin of mother's, since it was feared that the rumble of Hitler's bombs might reach Paris. It did, but only after our departure for America, and I think one of the few bombs actually dropped on the city did hit our building as we were crossing on the Champlain. The vessel, too, is destined to be destroyed after having safely delivered us with no more than the sprout of an occasional whale to alarm a couple of trigger-happy gunners. On its next voyage, for which we had originally held passage, it was sunk with all aboarded by a German submarine. Other than what already is or will now become publicly available, neither mother nor I can reconstruct much about the birth of the idea of V.N.'s mind, but can only alert the reader to some of the inane hypotheses that have been propounded, especially of late. As for the link with Lolita, the theme had probably lain dormant, as Nabokov suggested, on a book entitled Lolita, until the new novel began germinating, somewhat as in the case of interrupted Solus Rex in the later very different, but nonetheless related, Pale Fire. It is clear from Nabokov's postface to Lolita, originally written in 1956, that at the time he believed whatever copies had existed of Volshebnik typescript had been destroyed, and his recollection of the novella was somewhat blurred, partly by the passing of time, but mainly by his rejection of it as dead scrap. Superseded by Lolita, the surviving text probably turned up was not long before he proposed it, with reborn enthusiasm to G.P. Putnam's Sons, see author's note 2. I became aware of the work's existence quite late in a rather vague way, and had occasion to read it only in the early 80s, when our voluminous archives were finally organized by Brian Boyd, the author of a proper literary biography of V.N., to be published in 1988. It was then the Volshebnik which had been consulted by father in the 60s before it submerged anew among the jumble of belongings that had been shipped to Switzerland from the Ithaca warehouse resurfaced. I completed a more or less final draft of the translation in September of 1985. For the initial impetus to attack what was not an easy job, I must give heartfelt thanks to Matthew Broccoli, who had envisioned a very limited edition of the work, as Nabokov had originally suggested to Walter Minton, then president of Putnam. The timing of this public debut, The Enchanter, is not without amusing and instructive coincidental sidelight. In 1985, in Paris, there began an energetic one-man campaign to attribute to Vladimir Nabokov a pseudonymous, quite un-Nabokovian book from the mid-30s entitled Novel with Cocaine. Falling as it does within the very limited realm of rediscovered Nabokoviana, The Enchanter is a most appropriate example of the strikingly original prose, Nabokov's Siren, produced in his most mature and final years as a novelist and his mother tongue not long before writing The Enchanter in 1939. In fact, he had completed his first major English work, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, in 1940, was to be the year of our transplantation to the United States. For anyone who may harbor lingering doubts about the authorship of the other book, a quick comparison of the substance and style with those of The Enchanter should suffice to put the final round of shot into this moribund canard. A brief account of the bizarre affair is nevertheless perhaps in order. Early in 1985, in the Paris-based messenger of the Russian Christian movement, Professor Nikita Struve of the Sorbonne affirmed with great conviction that Novel with Cocaine by one M. Agayev, written in the early 30s in Istanbul, published soon thereafter in Paris Emigre Review numbers, was in fact the work of Vladimir Nabokov. To support this thesis, Struve abducted sentences from Novel with Cocaine that according to him are typical of Nabokov. Struve's assertions were taken up in a letter to the London Times Literary Supplement, 9 August 1985, from Julian Graffy of the University of London, who referred to Struve's detailed analysis of the secondary themes, structural devices, semantic fields, whatever those may be, and metaphors of in with sea, all which were found on the basis of repeated quotation and comparison to be quintessentially Nabokovian. There have since been other echoes of Struve's theory in several publications of Europe and the United States. One can cite numerous deficiencies in Agayev's style, blatantly incorrect forms, for instance, like Zakshiknu for sneezed and Ispul Zhovuya for to use, that are obvious to anyone with a knowledge of Russian. It is amazing that Sorbonne specialist in Russian language and literature like Struve, or a London University professor of Slavonic studies like Graffy, could have confused the incompletely educated Agayev's often vulgar or incorrect locutions with Nabokov's precise and subtle style. As Dmitry Savitsky notes in an article refuting Struve's theory in Russian thought, Paris, 8 November 1985, Nabokov's Russian possesses the impeccable rhythm of classical poetry, while Agayev's is contrived, jolting, uneven. One look at Agayev's style precludes the need to rebut the rest of Struve's arguments. In his 1986 book, Field ventilates the hypothesis that Novel with Cocaine might have been a deliberate mystification by Nabokov or by someone else. He ends by affirming nonetheless that it can be said with absolute certainty that there is some link between the work of Agayev and Siren, because there happens to be a partial assonance between the names of Agayev's character Senat and Nabokov's Cincinnatus, an invitation to a beheading. The Cincinnatus connection falls into the same category of scholarship as, say, Field's overblown claptrap about the extramarital affair, the total tripe about the secret heavy drinking, the nonsensical conjectures about father's death, and the contention that Nabokov in his letters to his mother addressed her as Lolita, whereon Field constructs a typical house of marked cards. In the latter case his reasoning goes as follows. Father, with the natural reserve of gentlemen, had preferred to omit the term of endearment with which he habitually addressed his mother, whose name was Helene, from the copies of the letters he showed to Field before Field revealed his true colors. Field, after having consumed, I suppose, many magnifying glasses, gleaned the trace of tail of hat of acrylic T at the edge of the blank space where the salutation had been excised. Incidentally, the handwritten lowercase Cyrillic T generally resembles the small Roman M, and is therefore tailless and hatless. For that reason, and because the missing word was about 7 letters long, and also because father had told him that Loliola was a perfectly normal Russian diminutive for Helene. And God knows what other reasons, Field concludes, not without a trace of personal outrage, that it was Lolita surely, and characteristically proceeds to prefer to this absurdity as an established fact further than on in the book. Not only does Lolita have only 6 letters, not only would the Latin derivation have been unthinkable within the parameters of Russian etymology, whereas Spanish cognates did not enjoy the same favor as French or English ones, but the word deleted out of a sense of privacy and out of respect for the memory of a beloved mother was the Russian radost, joy, dearest. It was Nabokov's habitual salutation with his mother, and of course we have the original letters to prove it, and Lolita Hayes was Juanita Dark in father's drafts of the novel until very late in the game. So much for Lolita, surely. But let us leave Field among the ruins and revisit in another corner of the scrap heap briefly to bury the Agayev matter, whose relevance here is the dramatic dissimilarity between the author's work and the Enchanter. Research by Frank Williams, who originally reviewed the English version of Agayev's book in the TLS on 5th July 1985, the French literary journalist Alain Garrick, who went all the way to Istanbul while preparing a lengthy article on the subject of liberation, and by others has confirmed the following sequence of events. After a novel with cocaine originally appeared in numbers and aroused a certain curiosity in immigrant circles, a Russian lady in Paris named Lydia Shervinskaya was asked to track down Agayev with the help of her parents, who happened to live in Istanbul, whence the manuscript had originally been sent. Shervinskaya found him there, confined to a mental institution because of tremors and convulsions. After being rescued by the lady's father, Agayev became a friend of the family and grew close to Shervinskaya, to whom he confided his real name, Mark Levi, and his complex and motley history, which included the killing of a Russian officer, flight to Turkey, and obsession with drugs. Levi Agayev went with Shervinskaya to Paris, but after a sojourn there returned to Istanbul, where he died, presumably from the consequences of cocaine abuse, but in 1936. V.S. Yanovsky, who is associated with numbers when the manuscript was first received in Paris and who now lives in a suburb of New York City, confirmed in an interview reported in the New York Times 8 October 1985 that when the manuscript arrived for publication in Russian, it bore the unequivocally Jewish signature Levi, and that somewhere along the line it was decided to substitute a more Russian-sounding name. Finally, inquiries by the translator of the French version of the novel that appeared in 1982, cited by Williams, reveal that Mark Abramovich Levi was buried in the Jewish cemetery of Istanbul in February 1936. While no literary adventurer would have a leg to stand on if he were to question the authorship of The Enchanter, Professor Struve appears determined to persist in his benighted and quixotic campaign to ascribe the Agay of work as well to Vienne, who, except for a brief contribution on a very different subject to its first issue, submitted no material to Numbers, which had really attacked him shortly thereafter, and had never visited Moscow, where the novel is set, with a considerable amount of local detail, never used cocaine or other drugs, and wrote, unlike Ungayev, in pure, correct St. Petersburg Russian. Furthermore, if indeed there had been any connection between Nabokov and novel with cocaine, someone among his literary acquaintances would have had an inkling of it, and if not, then his wife, first reader, and typist Baron Nabokov would surely have known. The stucco parapet of the Florida Terrace, where I am writing at this moment, the kind with white paint covering the deliberately uneven surface, is full of random patterns. It takes only a pencil stroke here and there to complete an excellent hippopotamus, a stern Flemish profile, a busty showgirl, or any number of friendly or disconcerting little free-form monsters. This is what Nabokov, who early in life had seriously considered becoming a painter, could do so well with an ornate lampshade, for example, or some repetitively flowered wallpaper. Comical faces, non-existent but plausible butterflies, and grotesque little creatures of his own invention gradually came to inhabit hospitable designs of the quarters of the Montreux Palace Hotel, where he lived and worked, and some of them happily survive to this day, preserved either on our express instructions or by the limited capacity for observations of the cleaning teams of that storm, like a defensive football line through those rooms every afternoon. A few particularly good ones have at last long since been deterred from the tiles adjacent to their bathtub that, to Field's apartment consternation, father used every day. Such enhancement and recombination of chance patterns are in a larger sense an essential part of Nabokov's creative synthesis. The fortuitous observation, the reported or imagined psychological anomaly, elaborated by the artist's fantasy, assumed a harmonious growth of their own. As the infant work was gradually weaned from the image, the news item, or the reverie that had jolted its cells into process of multiplication. Like certain of Nabokov's other works, The Enchanter is the study of madness seen through the madman's mind. Aberrations in general, both physical and psychological, were among the diverse sources of raw material that nurtured Nabokov's artistic fantasy. The criminal pedophilia of the protagonists, like that of the later Humbert in a new work in a different setting, like the murderous delusion of Hermann in Despair, like the sexual anomalies that are but one element of Pale Fire, and other works, like the madness of the chessmaster in Illusion, and the musician Bachmann, like the deformations of the potato elf, and of the Siamese twins in The Double Monster, was one among many themes in Nabokov selected for the creative process of fictional recombination. Perhaps what matters is not the human pain or joy at all, but rather the play of shadow and light on a live body, the harmony of trifles assembled in a unique and inimitable way, writes Nabokov in the concluding sentence of his 1925 short story, The Fight. This early expression, forthright yet undogmatic, of what was to remain an enduring aspect of his aesthetic approach is, I suspect, destined to be quoted often and not always in context. Perhaps the word with which Nabokov introduced the thought is an important qualifier. As a creative writer rather than a journalist, social commentator, or psychoanalyst, Nabokov chose to examine the phenomena of his surroundings through the refractive lens of artistry. At the same time, his codex for literary creation is no less precise than the scientific purity of his lepidopterological investigations, but even if his emphasis on the combinational delights in which an artist is privileged to indulge, by no means does it follow that Nabokov was indifferent to the horrors of tyranny, murder, the child molestation, to the tragedy of social or personal injustice, or to the plight of those who have somehow been short-sighted by fate. It is not indispensable to have known Father personally in order to understand this. It is enough to have read his books with reasonable care. For the poet, to Nabokov, to the vehicle of choice is the concrete artistic experience rather than the abstract declaration. However, if one is quest of quotable bits of credo, the miniature Socratic dialogue of the 1927 story The Passenger concedes another rare peek into the essence of his ethos. Life is more talented than we, says the first character, the writer. How can we compete with that goddess? Her works are untranslatable, indescribable, hence all that's left to us is to treat her creations as a film producer does a famous novel, altering it beyond recognition for the sole purpose of having an entertaining film unfold without a hitch, punishing virtue in the beginning and vice at the end. With a nun and details of Sunset and other stories translated by Dmitry and Vladimir Nabokov, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1976. Unexpected, but all-resolving outcome. We think that life's performance is too sweeping, too uneven, that your genius is too untidy. To indulge our readers, we cut out of life's untrammeled novels our neat little tales from the use of school children. Allow me in this connection to impart to you the following experience. At the story's end, his interlocutor, the wise critic, replies, "There is much in life that is casual. There is also much that is unusual. The word is given the sublime right and hence chance than to make of the transcendental something that is not accidental." But the writer's concluding thought expresses two further distinct, if undivorceable considerations: artistic curiosity and human compassion. The trouble is that I did not learn and shall never learn why the passenger cried. One suspects early on in the Enchanter that things will not end well, that the cynical, contemptible protagonist will get his due, and if his obvious moral is needed, this premonition is it. However, besides being part horror story, this is also part mystery thriller. False toys with the madman, now thwarting, now abetting, now providing a hair-raising close call. As events unfold, we do not yet know from which direction disaster will strike, but we sense increasingly that it is imminent. The man is a dreamer like others, although in this case a very rotten dreamer. Distasteful as he may be, though, one of the most poignant levels of the story is that of his occasionally objective introspection. One might even go so far as to say the story resides in the introspection, and through this introspection, on the basically evil protagonist's part, Nabokov succeeds in transmitting compassion not only for his victims, but to a degree for the villain himself. A yearning for that decency gleams now and then through the main single-minded cynicism, and prompts pathetic attempts at self-justification. Although the borderlines dissolve under the impetus of his compulsion, he cannot escape the fleeting realization that he is a monster, and while the woman he marries may be a repellent means to a criminal end, and the girl an instrument for his gratification, other nuances emerge. The viewpoint of the text, like many other aspects of the story, may sometimes be deliberately ambiguous, but the madman himself cannot avoid perceiving, in stunned moments of lucidity, the pathetic side of both mother and daughter. His pity for the former transpires with a kind of reverse Russian through the very revulsion on which he harps, and there is a moving instant of compassion when we see her, through his eyes, as pregnant with her own death. As for the girl, there exists a fragile, decent sliver of his soul that would like to feel a genuinely paternal love for her. The Enchanter, evil conjurer though he may be, lives partially in an enchanted world, and, common madman or not, he perceives himself on a special poetic plane as a mad king, for he knows that he is, in any case, mad, a king who is fleetingly reminiscent of another, thematically related, lone Nabokovian monarchs, and is, at the same time, a kind of lecherous Lear, living in a fairy tale seclusion by the sea with his little Cordelia, whom for a flicker of an instant he imagines as an innocently loved daughter, but as always the paternal shades rapidly into the infernal, and the beast within him plunges into a pedophile fantasy so intense that its consequences cause a female fellow passenger to change compartments. In agonizing moments of introspection, he recognizes the beast that tries to will it away. Ingeniously appropriate images recur in bestial counterpoint. Hyenas in every hygiene, onanastic tentacles, the lupine leer in place of the intended smile, the licking of chops at the thought of his defenseless sleeping prey, the whole leitmotif of the wolf about to devour his Red Riding Hood, complete with its eerie final echo. This dark beast within him, this bête noire of his, must always be construed as the protagonist's implicit self-perception, and in his rational moments it is what the enchanter fears most. Thus, catching himself in an absent-minded smile, he posits, with pathetic flimsy hope, that only humans are capable of absent-mindedness, and that therefore he too might after all be human. The stratification of the story is most striking in its double and triple-bottomed imagery. It is true in a sense that some delicate passages are more explicit than elsewhere in Nabokov, but at other moments the sexual undercurrent is no more than the glinting facet of a simile or the momentary derailment of a train of thought headed for a quite different destination. Multiple levels and senses, as is known, occur often in Nabokov, yet the line he treads here is razor-thin, and the virtuosity consists in a deliberate vagueness of verbal and visual elements, whose sum is complex, otherwise undefinable, but totally precise unit of communication. An analogous kind of ambiguity, whose purpose and synthesis are again the exact expression of a complex concept, is at times employed to convey the concurrent and conflicting thoughts racing through the protagonist's brain. As a limpid instance of what I mean, let me cite one such passage whose paradoxes at first sight challenge reader and translator alike, but when approached without selectively closing the switch on tracks of thought parallel to what at first seems the main line, again reward one of the crystalline whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. The openness of receptivity required here, which would perhaps represent overkill in dealing with more conventional writing, is akin to that which the sensitive ear will apply to the counterpoint of Bach, or the thematic texture of Wagner, or which a stubborn eye will force open a recalcitrant brain, when their possessor perceives that same elements of tricky design can simultaneously yield, say, an ape peering wistfully out of its cage and a beach ball bobbing helplessly out of reach amid the reflection of a sunset, or on the repetitious ripples of an azure sea. The protagonist, rather the face his odious nuptial obligations, has gone roaming in the night. He has considered various alternatives of disposing his newly acquired, already superfluous spouse, who is promisingly ill, but every moment of whose existence keeps him from the girl he craves. He has pondered poison, presumably entered a pharmacy, perhaps made a purchase. On his return he sees a strip of light under the door of the dear departed, and says to himself, "Charlatans! We'll have to stick to the original version." The concurrent ideas here can be listed thus. 1. He is disappointed that she has not gone to sleep. 2. He had half-consciously been equating sleep with death. Our seeing her through his eyes as the dear departed connotes his sarcastic reaction to her being A. awake and B. alive. 4. The term dear departed signifies that in his mind she is already dead or as good as dead. 5. He must now either satisfy his unappetizing bride or find plausible excuse to say good night and go to bed, the original version. 6. His access to the girl remains as problematic as ever. 7. The charlatans are A. the pharmacist whose potion he did not buy, B. the pharmacist whose potion he did buy but not use, C. the pharmacist whose potion he obsessed imagination is meanwhile administered, expecting to find the woman dead, equating, as we have seen, wakefulness with life, or pharmacists read the whole establishment for forensic medicine that has somehow let him down. D. The pangs of conscience and for fear that have made him discard the idea of poison, or murder in general, or E. the hope against hope that he has succeeded in simply willing her demise. 8. All of the above merge into a kaleidoscope of a mad mind. Did the man actually enter the pharmacy? Here or elsewhere, my translated ethics would prohibit adding to Father's text to make things more explicit in English than they are in Russian.